This episode is presented by DistroKid. DistroKid is the easiest way for musicians to get their music into all the platforms like Amazon, Apple, Tidal, TikTok, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You also get unlimited uploads, and artists keep 100% of their earnings. The DistroKid app is super easy to use, so check it out. Just go to distrokid.com/VIP/talk guitars to get 30% off. Hey people, do you want to get your music into Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Tidal, and all the rest of the streaming services? Check out DistroKid. It's affordable and super easy to use. I've used it to distribute my music and I really dig it. Our listeners get 30% off at distrokid.com/talk guitars. That's 30% off for our listeners at distrokid.com/talk guitars. Go get it. Hey everybody, it's Chris and Rick Talk Guitars, and today we're going to talk about mods then and now. And Chris and I have talked about mods before, but Chris had a great idea to kind of compare maybe modern mods or current mods on guitars and amps, maybe mostly guitars, I guess, compared to yesteryear when Chris and I were kind of, budding guitarists and seeing new gear, and then also what people were doing to mod the gear they already had. So yeah, Chris, why don't you start off by setting the table and then get us going?
It's pretty interesting when you follow modifications to guitars and amps throughout the years because it parallels the growth of the sophistication of the guitar player. You know what I mean? The average guitar player now is way more sophisticated than they were back in the day. For your just average person picking up the guitar, they're way more knowledgeable about this stuff. So that's one thing that really changed. I'm trying to think of like the biggest mods back in the day.
Yeah.
Going all the way back to like the Beatles, what was really big thing to do was take the finish off your guitar, right? So it wasn't only the Beatles, I think it was both John and George that did it, and Paul maybe, but it was also Mark Bolan, just tons of people. And
Ronson,
yeah. Ronson was a pretty famous one too. Yeah. And that was supposedly just to make the guitar breathe more or something like that. There's, certain mods, there's certain like category of mods that have remained the same since then and now, and just maybe certain elements have changed. There's basically two categories of mods that when I think of modifications, it's either like the personalization mod, where you kind of like do things to make it more like your own, and then there's like the performance or the hot rod mod. To make it behave a little bit different. And cool. I think a lot of the modifications back in the day tended to be lean towards the performance modifications, and a lot of them were like professional people, like people with money who had guitar techs and things like that, and they would a lot of times have those modifications done. Your average lay guitar person, I think they kind of leaned more towards personal modifications, like I want to put some, I'm going to put new tuners on this or something like that, or like, I want to put these pretty speed knobs on. Now performance mods are huge with, even lay guitar people, you know what I mean? They're constantly doing things to make their guitar play more the way that they want, faster or whatever. I don't know. Back in the day, a lot of guitar players, professional guitar players, another big mod they would have is they'd have the neck shaved. A lot of them were playing Gibson guitars, and they had those big fat necks that we really love today.
Yeah.
And they didn't like it so much. I know Jimmy Page had it done, but I don't know if it's like his number one and his number two that they had it shaved down. But I mean, many guitar players, that was a very common thing to do. You get a cool 50s Gibson, and it's like, let's deal with this neck. This neck is too thick, so we'll shave it down, because back then skinny necks were in. And when I say skinny, it's the depth wise. It's not the width wise.
The profile.
Depth wise. Yeah. And that's a thing that, although not a modification, but it's just kind of interesting to look at the neck profiles that were really popular back then compared to now. Now everybody wants a big fat neck, you know what I mean? Yeah. And back then it was kind of more like the slim, the fast. They call them slim, fast necks that they have, that everybody kind of liked back then. So, it's kind of interesting to see the evolution of like neck profiles. One of the earliest things that you could do to a guitar is pickups. They were like the very early replacement pickup people like DiMarzio and, Seymour Duncan, eventually Mighty Mite. That was another
I
big
remember Mighty Might. Yeah.
pickup company, but they also made other parts that you could hot rod or change
Yeah.
things out on. So yeah, I mean, we'll talk about the pickup mods in a minute. I just kind of want to talk more about the general things then versus now and people that would have modifications. We joke about the 70s, late 70s and early 80s being the bronze age or the brass age. Yeah, that's when everything was supposed to be brass. So at first you would buy replacement. I'm going to get a brass nut, I'm going to get a brass bridge, I'm going to get brass, blah, blah, blah. And you'd add it to your guitar. But then manufacturers started picking up on that. Oh, they want brass. So we started putting them on production guitar.
Right.
Started to get brass because brass will add sustain to your guitar. And everybody believed that, even the people making guitars picked up on it. So that was just a given. It's like, yeah, I'm going to get rid of this nut and get a brass nut. Now it's something like, who would even think of that? And on your list of things you would want to do to modify your guitar, putting a brass nut on there is pretty low, if it's even on there at all. What else would they do? Bridges too. A lot of people pretty early on, probably in the late 70s, early 80s, people started to want to deal with Gibson guitars with the wraparound bridge. You have to have an intonatable bridge. So there's like the Badass Bridge Company and all these other companies that made bridges. And that's going strong today. I mean, there's like many boutique companies that make intonatable or just like tapered bridges that are compensated better than the standard bridge.
Yeah.
That was a big one back then.
Well, and tuners was a big thing for me that I saw a lot of people change, but also for us because of the, Eddie Van Halen and everything else, everybody was having their guitars routed out to put Floyd Rose bridges on them. It was common where in my area where people just wanted that whammy system that wouldn't go out of tune, quote, right? And it locked at the nut and locked at the bridge. And tons of people had their guitars modded to accommodate for those. And it's super invasive, but yeah, people are doing that.
It's unfortunate. Where I was, it wasn't really that big of a thing. I didn't really run into that much.
Yeah.
It was more rock and punk rock people.
That's interesting though, because I do think probably, mods may differ quite a bit based on geography, right? Or where you're, that's super cool.
There's something you have to, when we start talking about this stuff, you have to point out something. It's like, we can't make these generalizations based on a handful of personal experiences too.
Right.
You know what I mean? What I'm going by in this is like articles, magazines. I have a bunch of like vintage books on, you probably do too, on guitar making, like projects for the musician, modify your guitar and things like that.
Yeah.
I look at all that because I'm not, my experience is different than yours already. We can tell now. So I'm not going to make, generalizations based on that. But you're right. I mean, geographically and the type of music that you were in. I mean, I was in for a while. I was in like a top 40 band. And I'll go back to what you said because it was a pretty important one. Tuners. Yeah. That was one thing that pointed also to the unsophisticatedness of the guitar player back then. Back then, anytime you were having a tuning issue, you changed the tuners. You don't know. Guitar players now know that's not what you do. Many of them do. Most of them do. You know what I mean? Yeah. So a lot of people change tuners. And, this thing still doesn't get in tune, because they really didn't know what was going on with the physics of their guitar. So I did that. That was one of the first things I did. My first good guitar that I really, really loved was an Epiphone ET270, which is like the Strat-shaped Epiphone Japanese. That's like, I think Kurt Cobain played one for a while. I love the guitar, but, it had like these kind of crappy tuners on it. I wasn't really having tuning problems, but I put Grover tuners on it. That was one of the first things I did. And that was a big deal. And then I was playing it, and all of a sudden the big E string popped off the neck, and I'm like, what the fuck's up? And the nut broke, so I had to have a bone nut made. And I want to ask you something. This was like a huge deal to me the few times that I had to send my guitar off to, have to take it in to get it fixed.
Right.
It was like the most horrible thing in the world, waiting for your guitar. Because sometimes it would take like a week and you didn't have another guitar. And so it was a big fucking deal. And, especially that happened pretty early on where I broke the nut on that guitar. So I didn't have it very long. I'm like, I got to give this guitar up for like a week or something. And it was just like walking around the house, pacing and everything else. So it was a big deal. So yeah, the tuner thing is something I did. I didn't do it because of tuning problems. I just did it because the other ones looked kind of cheap. And and they were good tuners. They're Grovers, and the Grovers at that time were great. It's weird because that's gone the other way too. You know what I mean? Everybody put fucking Grovers on their Gibsons, right? Grovers were really big back then. Now people will get those old Gibsons with Grovers and they'll get the kits to put them back to the Kluson or whatever. Yeah. So for some nowadays, that's kind of a performance thing because lots of people get locking tuners. They want that just for the ease of, for changing strings and whatnot. I don't really go for those. But like I was saying, back then, me and I'm sure other guitar players of the time, and even reading interviews with top of the heap professional guitar players, a lot was unclear about guitar physics and what was going on with them. And
Right.
so people really didn't know. So we would think things like it's not staying in tune, so it's got to be the tuners. That's the only thing it can be.
Exactly.
And you wouldn't know anything about when you change strings, your guitar would be out of whack for like 3 days before you
Yeah.
figure out how can I get this thing back in tune.
Well, it's a good point because it does become mythology at a certain point. Because, like you were saying, I remember buying less expensive guitars and immediately just changing the tuners, just like you were saying, without really noticing any tuning issues. But it's just like, oh yeah, these tuners are probably cheap. I need to upgrade them to Schallers or Grovers, right? Whatever. And I did that on my V, right? Like, and the original tuners that came with that were pretty cool. I think they were the metal ones, the triangle ones that.
Right.
But of course, I just reflexively put new tuners on it because, and like you said, exactly. It's like, well, the truth is, it's a setup, it's the nut, it's all this stuff that isn't associated with the tuners.
The problem with that, let's just speak to that for a moment, like the tuning issues and why we were such idiots back then. It's kind of like unclear, confusing terms. It's like, so you put on a new set of strings, right? What's the first thing you do? You stretch your strings. No, you don't. The strings don't stretch. They're the same length when you put them on and when you take them off, a year later or whatever.
Yeah.
What you're doing is you're pulling the slack out from around the tuning peg, right?
Yeah.
So, and then they came up with that thing that that I fucking hate is that like
the rabbit hole,
where you tie the string in a knot around your tuner or something so it doesn't slip. That's the other one. The tuner's slipping. It's not slipping. The tuner isn't slipping. The slack. It's the slack is getting pulled out of the tuner, so it's going flat, right? When you start out with terms like that, you have this thing in your mind where it's like, and I always thought, here I am stretching my strings. Man, come on, get stretched out. I mean, are you as long as you're going to get yet? Because I want to play this thing. And it's ridiculous. And once that's the key thing about guitars and modifications and everything. It's like very, very simple physics. And once you know that and trust that, you can do these modifications and choose which ones you want to do, which ones you don't want to do.
Yeah.
And it just like really frees you up. It took me the longest time before I started to figure some of that shit out. It was almost like a mystical instrument too. It's like, I'm not going to adjust the truss rod on this. I don't trust, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to fuck it up. I want somebody who's qualified to do this. So I had setups done and all this other shit. Then down the road, you just learn, my guitar tech isn't playing this thing. Why is he setting it up? So you just learn how to do it. So
I took the pickup covers off because again, there was this, remember, I mean, a lot of people did that when their standard came with pickup covers or mine, the V's came with pickup covers too. And I took them off because, the mythology again was, your guitar will sound different without those metal covers over the bobbins and all that other stuff. But I don't know. Again, it was just like something that was in the ether that I thought, oh yeah, that makes sense, dude. It's like, okay, I can measure this difference. But yeah, so those are the two things I did to the V. I think I just used the stock pickups in that guitar, which were cool. I think they were T-tops, right? For the 80s.
They probably would have been. Yeah, I don't know
like that.
what they used.
But they sounded great. The pickups sounded great. And so, but those are the only two things I did to that guitar. But, early on, I had a Mateo Strat that I think I put new pick. Oh, I did. I put an Eddie Van Halen pickup in there, because I was trying to Eddie Van Halenize that guitar at the time. That was, my impressionable years, right? Coming up as a guitar player. So I did that, went down that rabbit hole. And also I told you about that dude I knew that had the Warmoth parts guitar, right? Which is another mod kind of esque thing where you could acquire all these different crazy parts and put them together, and you've got this unique guitar that is yours. I remember that vividly from my early years too. But I think it's interesting to think about like maybe how, like you were saying years ago, guitarists weren't as sophisticated, and then also there weren't as many options of models and everything else guitar wise, right? Gibson had a few models, Fender had a few models, but nothing like the models they have today. So I'm curious to know, get your take on like how you think maybe the proliferation of models within guitar manufacturers and also like custom shop and all this other stuff, how that plays into like maybe whether guitar players either want to customize their guitars more, mod their guitars more or less based on kind of that evolution. You know what I mean?
You would think it would be less because, there's so many things.
Yeah.
Like anytime someone even mentions that, hey, this is pretty cool, you got like 4 guitar companies doing it to
Totally.
be the first one to bring it to market.
Yeah.
So, Yeah, you don't, but a lot of this stuff comes down to, let's say you play with Barbie dolls. I don't anymore. You want to buy stuff for your dolls, you know what I mean? I want to buy
Right.
shoes. I want to buy this little thing for it. And the
Right.
guitars are the same way. You get a guitar and it's like, I love this thing. You know, I want to get something for my guitar. There's a little bit of that going on. Trying to trick it out a certain way and just make it feel more like your own. If we could get a time machine, and all right, we're going to send one guitar player back to like 79, and he's going to look at all the mods, going to take another one and send them from 79 up to here. And the
Yeah.
guy's going to go back to 79, and somebody's going to be talking about brass nut and brass stuff. And the guy from now is going to go, what the fuck are you talking about? What is this? You know, they're like,
Yeah.
sustain,
Yeah.
it's sustain, it's sustain.
Exactly.
And then the dude from 79 is going to come up here and someone's going to go, look, I got $25 tone caps in my guitar.
Yeah.
He goes, are you fucking out of your mind? It's just like weird, wooey, superstitious bullshit that, you know, is fun. So we
Yeah.
do it. That, I mean, that falls into maybe into the performance one, but it's more like snake oil stuff that we all do. And yeah, you got to try it sometimes. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like you said, this is not scientific at all. And I subscribed to Guitar Player magazine in the 70s, and I bought them frequently. So, I had a stack of them. Chris has a stack of them. We consumed the media at the time that dealt with guitar players and guitar player idiosyncrasies. And we were also musicians playing in bands at the time too. So it's not like we're experts or we can draw any specific conclusions based on that, but there is some stuff to draw from in our experience and what we've consumed media wise. So I think it's interesting to, like I said, I kind of want to get back, maybe you talking more about the differences between then and now. And then also, as I mentioned, like just the choice that we have these days is so immense. Like we talk about that all the time, like, the abundance of everything now. And like you said, there's so many models, you can get close to probably exactly what you would get if you had one modded off the shelf, right? A guitar, right? Because you could get a Strat with different pickup configurations that's a model right now, right? That isn't a custom guitar. It's just like, yeah, that's our, it's got a humbucker in the bridge and two single coils. We've got that one. We've got the three single coils. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is unnecessary, but it's like it's modding for modding sake is a thing. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter. There's a lot of people, and I'm kind of surprised at how many people cannot deal with the pickups that came in a guitar. They're like, that's one step of getting a guitar for
Right,
them is buying a
right,
guitar
right.
and then finding the pickups to go into these guitars.
Yeah.
I don't understand it at all. And that's another interesting thing about then and now. Back in 1979, what was happening then is, guitar players making all the cool rock records that we really love were taking out their PAF pickups and putting DiMarzio Super Distortion pickups in there, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and those records still sounded great. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? No one's going to deny that a PAF pickup is not desirable, but that's what they were fucking doing. And that was
Yeah.
their modification. And the reason why they were doing it is because they were going from an Alnico whatever pickup and they're putting a ceramic DiMarzio in there. So that's a huge difference in output. So it's going to be really big and woofy and dark and stuff. And so
Yeah.
they'll notice right away. Super noticeable. What now people will do, they'll take a pickup that's PAF, put another one in that's from another make. It's not going to sound that much different. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In the context of things.
I think another thing, what's your take on musicians versus like just the guitar hobbyists? Because we see that all the time, right? We see people that on the forums online and stuff like that, where they're all talking about, guitars and guitar culture versus like the musicians that are, making music, at all levels really. But just as, if you're a musician, I just wonder what's your take on, do you think musicians of modern musicians, are they modding as much as musicians did back then? Do you think there's a huge difference between then and now with musicians?
I think there's a bit of a difference, but I don't think they're actually modding themselves. They might be having their guitar tech or something. And I think like a lot of professional musicians currently, they're doing the pickup swap thing too, unless they can afford a vintage instrument that has, desirable vintage pickups in it.
Yeah.
They'll be swapping pickups too. So I don't think that's any different, but there are modders for modder's sakes. I mean, that's kind of where their enjoyment comes from. I mean, they play guitar. Yeah. They might not even really love guitar that much, but they like it or something like that. But they love fiddling with stuff. Fender guitar style guitars are fun to make. You can do it. You can make them and trick them out. And that's somebody that's their passion.
Yeah.
Why? So I think that modern guitar players that are professional guitar players playing and making records and stuff, they're way more savvy than they were in the 70s. They don't do a lot of the tinkering themselves. I don't think. I really don't. think that's the case. And probably because they don't have time because they're writing and music, touring, and making records.
Yeah, that's true.
But something interesting that I just thought of when you're saying that is
Yeah.
I'm always interested in when I could ever find anybody like a guitar tech, an amp tech, whatever, and what they do with like amps and pedals and stuff, what they did back then. And so I was reading this article about Waylon Jennings, guitar tech, and it was cool because it says, he makes his own amplifiers. And I'm like, oh, that's really cool. What were they doing back here? I think this is like 78 or something like that.
Uh-huh.
And they said, tell me about this amp you make. He goes, oh, well, I take a twin reverb and I adjust the bias and then I put groove tunes in for more grind. I'm like, there's a lot of, first of all, you're not making an amp. That's not making an amp. Second of all, you're doing it backwards. And third of all, we all know, and I knew pretty early on that Groove Tubes doesn't make tubes. You know what I mean? They're like, you can't buy a Groove Tube. You buy tubes that Groove Tube bought from whoever
Right,
and
right.
measured and put them in boxes for you. So I'm not calling this guy it was just odd because I was super interested in him.
Yeah.
If you're biasing the amp and then putting new tubes in it, that's backwards. And second of all, making an amp means like building something.
Yeah.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
Well, see, he modded this.
it was a modification, but I would have been blown away by that. I would have never ever thought that I would ever be able to get anywhere near even like servicing an amp or something
Right.
like that.
Oh yeah, totally.
You open it up like, holy shit, I'm not doing anything in there. And plus, you heard from the time you get your tube amp, you're going to kill yourself. That amp's going to kill you. There's
exactly
deadly voltage in there, and you're going to die if you go in there.
I'm trying to think back if pedal modification was a huge deal when we were growing up as opposed to now, or now again, it seems like there's so many pedal manufacturers that modding a pedal would be kind of moot, right? Because you can get any pedal you could think of now these days. So, but I say that, but it's like you say, I think there always is a certain contingent of people that are tinkerers, right? They want to get in and do stuff, or like you're saying, I was certainly that way. I mean, I did work on my own guitar, like soldering and shit like that and replacing stuff. But like you were saying, I never touched my amps because A, I knew nothing about them, and B, yeah, like you were saying, it's like I don't want to get electrocuted. But pedals to me, I never modded a pedal. I never even thought of modding a pedal back then. Did you? As a kid? Yeah.
Not back in the 70s. I mean, if something broke, I was so poor that I tried to fix it, and I probably did, but that would probably be the case where like a battery snap cable came off.
Yeah.
Or something really obvious. Yeah. But I look around in there, I don't know what the fuck that stuff is. I would love to because I was always a tinkerer, and I did things like I made like cabinets, speaker cabinets and stuff like that, just fucking around. But it was many years before I did. And even then it's, I could see better back then, because there's a lot of tight space in there. And I still love, I did last year. I love making like really simple pedals. My favorite pedals to make are the really simple circuits because you can do them, point to point, and then they all sound good. That's the thing for me. Speaking of mods and everything else, I've just learned the more I play, the less shit I want in my stuff. Yeah. So my amps, I don't want a lot of shit. Look inside like a Mesa Boogie, but that's too much. I don't want fucking that much stuff in my amp. It seems like the less stuff you get between your guitar and the tubes and the speaker is like it's just gonna sound better, and that might be ridiculous, and I have no science behind that, but that's how I feel. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there were many like mod amps I remember back in the day. Most of those were like mods to Marshalls, like master volume mods and things like that, or like kind of souping up those, or souping up some of the Fenders, like a master volume or an overdrive, and all those just seemed really poorly advised to me. I just love those amps so much. Yeah, you can imagine having like an old Marshall and putting a hole in it and making some sort of hacky master volume.
Well, then that's another, to segue to another kind of aspect of the mod stuff, which we talked about before, and other people talk about too, is kind of once a lot of this gear becomes precious and vintage and all this other stuff, then it becomes mournful that, oh yeah, well, I had this pre-CBS black panel amp and I did all this crap to it, and now it's, it's still worth some, but it's not worth what it was. And not only that, it's just like you were saying, it's like there's something, I'm the same way. I love stock gear for the most part. 99.9% of the time, because I just think it's built for a certain purpose, and this is what it is. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but once it establishes its self in the pantheon of gear, like Princeton's or Deluxes or any of the cool Fender amps, then it becomes this thing where you regret modifying something that is inherently so cool and becomes kind of this icon, right?
Right, right.
Well, so just thinking, because I mean, we've all told stories of stuff vintage gear we've ruined back in the day just because we were ding dongs. So it's interesting because the gear that you could buy now that's new, I don't know if it will hold the same. Maybe some models might. You know what I mean? Like become kind of icons in the way these other, like a burst or this other stuff.
Yeah, I don't know. There's so much of it now. It's
Yeah,
really hard to tell. I don't think so. I mean, there's some things that maybe had a short run. I mean, look at the Klon. I mean, that was a 90s
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
So, there might be a few things like that. But yeah, I think those old Martins and Gibsons and Fenders and stuff, there weren't that many of them. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah,
Now there's so many, like you mentioned, a million
yeah,
zillion models.
yeah.
So yeah, probably not. So I mean, I was thinking when you're talking about that, I have my Japanese Les Paul, which is a vintage from 1980, and it's the Japanese market one. So it's like the Gibbs, it got the Gibson headstock, the binding on the fret heads and all that stuff. It's a great guitar, and that one I modified. That was probably the last time I modified a guitar, but everything I did with that guitar, I did it just for me to make it a player. One of the things I did was I just scraped that finish off the back of the
Oh
neck
yeah,
because it was black. It was cool. Now I kind of wish I maybe would have left it alone, but it definitely played better, and I like to play it more after I
yeah,
did that. And Japan, even on their beautiful guitars, sometimes they just have the shit electronics in there. I mean, I don't know
yeah.
why they do that. They're known for this really, this great craftsmanship in their guitars, and then you open them up and it's like shit electronic
Electronics.
parts. So I
Yeah,
just changed the pots, and I think the caps, just put whatever I had in there. So yeah, I mean that's been modded, and that's all been like kind of, I guess you would call it performance. That was like the last guitar. I like my stuff stock, and
yeah.
that took me a long time to learn. Why don't I just buy things I like?
Well, that's the interesting part of this whole mod conversation too, is I think nowadays I would imagine, I don't know, but I would imagine, yeah, that the modding thing isn't as pervasive as it was because, like I said, you can buy how many models of a Strat are there now with different radius fretboards and different neck shapes and things like that. So, a player looking for a guitar, if they're thoughtful about it and they kind of have an idea of what they want, they can probably just get something that's already built that will fit the bill, right?
Sure, hopefully a lot of people do.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people like, here's their steps to having a Stratocaster. Go buy a Stratocaster and go on Facebook and ask everybody what pickups. And then after everybody mentions 5,000 pickups, you choose one that you were going to choose in the first place. You put those in there. And then you go out to the shed and you get your orbital sander and you fucking
Take the
sand the
finish.
top of the guitar in a few spots so it looks absolutely nothing like an old
Oh,
guitar.
got it
And then,
right. The relic.
yeah, I don't want to go too far into that, but we should just touch upon that for a second.
Yeah.
That would be something that would blow the 79 person's mind.
Exactly. That's a great point. Yeah.
But that's at the same time, if you brought a 79 guy from, from the past into the future, and this person happened to be familiar with beautifully played in vintage guitars, and you showed him some of the early, like the distressed guitars that Fender
Yeah.
started out making
Yeah.
and that Gibson started out making before they lost their fucking minds, they'd be like, cool, this feels like, that's the whole point, is it feels like an old guitar.
Yeah.
And then and it became this weird thing where that's not what it is anymore. It's this weird art project where it's nothing found in nature. Like, fuck, I remember the first time I played a really nice, what was it called? I don't know, it was a Road Worn or one of those things. It was very subtle. And
Yeah.
I was still working at Emerald City Guitars at the time. And I'm like, this is fucking great. I mean, this is it was like $500-$600 or something like that. And it felt like an old Strat. I can get on board with this. That time is gone. So that's something that would freak someone out completely. It's like, what the fuck are you
Right.
doing?
Oh yeah, dude. I was beside myself if I got a scratch on my new guitar or even if it was a used guitar that I bought, right? Because I would polish
Yeah.
it and clean it and yeah, and to think back then I would take sanders to it and try to make it look like it was dragged through the muck is beyond me. Yeah, or would have been beyond me. I couldn't even imagine that. Yeah. Yeah, because at the time too, even when we were talking about the Beatles Epiphones that they stripped off or Ronson's guitar. I saw those guitars, but I never until much later when you read about it and stuff like that. I just thought, oh, I thought that's a natural ES guitar. Oh, or I did think like Ronson's Les Paul looked weird because I'm like, I see it's double
I've never
bound,
seen
it's
one
double
like that, yeah.
bound, but yeah. So but I never put it together that oh he must have sanded the top finish off of that late '60s Les Paul Custom to get more tone out of the.
Yeah, and that's exactly why those people, they all did it for the same reson. They did it because they heard that,
Yeah.
taking the finish off allowed the instrument to
Yeah.
breathe or whatever.
Yeah.
It looked cool. I mean, it became historic instruments. I like that you mentioned that baby and guitars because that used to be a thing. Like, oh my God, the first
Oh man.
Nick you get now, it's like I play them and I knock the dust off them, but I don't really stress about that. But I did. I mean, like back when you could only have one guitar, you know what I mean? And that probably had something to do with people's lack of modifications too. It's like you have one guitar. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? You be careful, like, what you do if you screw up something. I think we've all, not necessarily musical gear or something, but we've all tried to do something to make it better, and it went the other way.
Yeah.
And we're like, oh, fuck. Well, I got to throw this out. So when you have one guitar, you're probably less likely to do that. Speed knobs on my Epiphone, that was a big one. And that was
that's
cool because it
hilarious.
had these really dorky, the original knobs, which were really dorky, like they looked like they came off an old radio or something. And those speed knobs looked really cool. And they were really, when you rolled the tone and the volume up, it felt really smooth. So that was a good one for me. I like that.
Yeah. I think I did swap some knobs on a couple of my guitars too, because I think it was more aesthetics.
I mean, I have an ad here with Rick Derringer he's got a Flying V and he's like, all my guitars have DiMarzios in it. It was
Yeah.
like a 50s Flying V. So it's like that had
Oh my
PAFs in it.
gosh.
And now it's got DiMarzio. And you can see it's the double, what do you call them, with the hex head, the double
pole
hex head.
pieces, the pole.
Mighty Might, they were huge. Yeah, let's talk for a minute about your options for modding stuff because Mighty Might was the first one that I had realized. They did like pickups. I think they started with pickups. Then they started doing necks and bodies and bridges. And then, they got into the brass market. What else was there? Schecter, that they did really good wood bodies and good hardware and shit like that. And then eventually started making guitars. All parts came they came in like in the, I think it was started in the 80s, early to mid 80s. All parts started to become a player and they were really big in the 90s. I mean, I don't know if Emerald City still does that, but we used to order tons of shit through them.
Yeah, I think they still
to
do. Yeah.
repair and,
Yeah.
restore guitars. Chandler, you remember them? They sold
Oh, yeah, yeah.
lipstick pickups
Yeah,
and they started making
totally.
guitars. They were a big one. And there's a company called Performance Guitar out of Los Angeles, and they did the same thing, like hot rodded. This is just before the Super Strat, like when the Super Strat became the, one humbucker, two single coils, pointy headstock guitar. This was like, these would be considered like the first Schecters were Stratocasters, and they were kind of would be considered Super Strats because they would have like hot pickups and things like that. And they might have started putting humbucker in the bridge position, but that was them heading towards Super Strat era, which I remember really, really well. And I'm sure it was huge here. It wasn't that big in the circles that I ran in back there, but it was all over. Like you talk about magazines, MTV, everything. They were everywhere. Everybody had the Super Strat.
Yeah.
And that was a product of people like, it started probably with Eddie Van Halen, and it was a
Oh,
modification.
totally did.
Created that Super Strat basically because he made the first Super Strat. I think. I mean, I think Schecter may have been before him or right around the same time or something. But yeah, so you had all these companies that would sell you stuff. So, and that was before people were slapping together Strats as much as they were now. I mean, those companies I just mentioned that made bodies and necks, some people would do it, but that was pretty rare to run into something. I remember very distinctly this is back when I was in the top 40 bar circuit for like 2 years or whatever. I knew more people that one of them was my cousin's husband who played a really beautiful Stratocaster. I think it was an early 70s Stratocaster. It was the big headstock, but it was like it was a nice one. I played it. It was nice and light. And he traded it straight up for a Schecter parts guitar that somebody made, and it had like a mirror pick guard on it. I played that one too, and I'm like, I don't know why you did this. But I would have taken the other one. But yeah, so people were getting like those part Strats, like high performance part Strats, and getting rid of their other guitars. So
Well, that was fun, man. I hope you all dug it out there. We appreciate you guys listening. We're members of the Runist Media Network, and listen to us on all your podcast streaming services, and give us a shout out. Send something to us and connect with us. Thanks for listening. What do you got, Chris?
make sure your Tube Screamer has the correct chip in it so you can get that perfect mid hum.
flowers and